The 20th century was a period of time that saw the rise of two superpowers who divided the world by political and economic ideologies. This division delineated states by their relationship to the superpowers. Each state was either part of the first, second, or third world. Each state was forced to ally themselves politically and economically with either Western capitalism or Eastern communism. This choice was not voluntary for any state who wanted to participate in the global community. In return for their ideological adherence, countries received financial, diplomatic, and military help from the two powers. Cuba and China adopted communism as the archetype for their societies rather than capitalism. Each had used Soviet communism as a model for how their societies should develop. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the changing world political climate, each has adapted their states differently. China and Cuba share similar communist incubations, but they are far from fraternal twins, and each have manifested communism differently. Geographically, China and Cuba's geography could not be more different. Cuba is an island with limited resources and a small population, and the limited amounts of trade in the modern times. Its global location has made it an important asset for the USSR and dangerous neighbor for the US during the Cold War. China is the exact opposite of Cuba. It has a large landmass and the world's largest population, and is also the US's largest trading partner because of its access to resources. Historically, Cuba has had a long history of being exploited by external world powers, starting with the Spanish, then with the US, and eventually the USSR. This exploitation by the USSR is the main reason that Cuba has the type of communism that it does today. China, on the other hand, has mostly been independent for the last 1,000 years. Their history is one of the oldest cultures in the world. In the 20th century, the struggle against the US-backed nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the leader of Mao Zedong that resulted in a new brand of communism from Mao's own interpretation of Marxism.
History and culture have deeply affected China's economy. The Communist Party in place has managed to make China a rising imperial power. Looking at China, one would have to wonder how much power the Communist Party has over the economy. It has been argued that a state-based section of the ruling class is at the core of power in China and that the Chinese Communist Party controls it. The party controls key aspects of the economy by closely regulating monetary and tax policies. In essence, China has become a huge international presence in the currency and financial market. Unlike China, Cuba's history has not allowed it to be as successful in the economic sector. Cuba faced a deep economic crisis after the Soviet Union's collapse in the 1990s. Fidel Castro started making changes because initially he would not allow for economic reform, claiming it would put at risk the revolution. It was observed that one of Cuba's biggest problems was the subordinate position it was in regards to the international economic order, and partly in problems with Cuba's socialist path of development. Eventually, a focus was put on the growing tourist sector as well as other economic reforms. Both China and Cuba, the Communist Party has been very influential in maintaining control of the people's thought of the people through the ideologies that they present as the absolute official truth of the state. Although the Communist Party no longer controls every aspect of life for the Chinese people, it is clear that those with party connections are better off than their non-party counterparts. Individuals with communist membership and education have a higher chance of entering an administrative elite with social prestige, authority, and material privileges. Essentially, the power to offer career opportunities has been established by the Chinese Communist Party as an effective way to maintain a system of social control, such as rewards for loyalty and ideological conformity. China uses a reward system as well as political repression to maintain political loyalty, who, very much like Cuba, also has a formal system of social control. Even though there are various positive ways that the party has maintained the citizens' loyalty, such as having a charismatic leader, such as Fidel Castro, and placing an emphasis on the history of the island, is that overall social life tends to be politicized, making social behavior subject to political interpretation. Cuba's system of formal control is aimed at stopping dissidents and organizations that don't agree with the party. There are various ways that the repression is used to stop dissidents, such as incarceration, surveillance, public discredit, verbal threats, economic injury, and maybe significantly detentions.
Cuba was under the leadership of Fidel Castro for over 60 years. There are no term limits for the prime ministers of Cuba, thus allowing for Castro to lead for such a long term. Under the prime minister, there are two main committees, the National Assembly and the Council of Ministers. Both of these committees are composed of people from the Communist Party of Cuba, which was also led by Castro up until his retirement. After his retirement, his brother Raul took over through succession. The Chinese structure of government is far more sophisticated than that of Cuba's, resulting in a more advanced and stable nation. Communist China is led by the CCP, who have been in power for 63 years. The Chinese government is broken down into ministries and sub-ministries with independent courts, military, and departments. One main committee, the Politburo Standing Committee, has the power to pass legislation. However, unlike Cuba, they have term limits and may be removed from power. In addition to the term limits, China also allows the subcommittees and committees to have the power to check and pass legislation upon consensus. Lastly, there is an adequate separation of power between the military, the courts, and the legislators, creating for a more involved government. Not only is their government impressive, their economic standing is one of the highest in the world. One of the main reasons it is successful is that it uses an ideology called performance legitimacy, which the government relies on accomplishing concrete goals such as economic growth, social stability, and national unity to help its economy prosper. One of China's main attributes is that it allows for capitalism, thus increasing its potential and leading to a more stable economy. On the other hand, Cuba is financially in a deficit, with rising unemployment as well as a government that hasn't changed the way they run their economy for over 60 years, resulting in an economic standing that has remained unchanged and remains at a second world level. In conclusion, it is important to understand that because two nations share an ideology, it doesn't mean that the two societies are identical. In the case of China and Cuba, the differences outweigh the similarities. Geographically, their land masses could not be more different in terms of size, shape, resources, and populations. Economically, China has hybridized and capitalized their economy with a mixture of communism and capitalism, while Cuba is still subsistence farming and relying on external nations to supplement its income. Finally, the leadership styles of China have changed dramatically over the last half-century. China has had a continuous exchange of power between presidents, while Cuba's ability to move from the control of one family, Fidel and Raul, to a non-Castro leader is yet to be seen. All these aspects add up to create a picture of unique states that have manifested two distinct types of communism because of their geographic, historical, economic, and leadership differences.